Well, this is new territory for me. I've ranked all the Nintendo consoles and controllers, and it only felt right to do the same with Sony's consoles and handhelds. I'll be ranking them based off how well they've aged and the features they currently have, as well as the game library and overall enjoyability. So with that, let's get her ranked. 22. PSP Go. I feel really bad about putting this smexy handheld so low on the list, because I'm such a sucker for sliding devices. My first phone was the LG Neon, and it had this awesome physical keyboard and I was addicted to it as a teenager, so having my hands on this device brings back a nostalgic burst of joy. But there's only one problem. It's a digital-only system that I can't use. My experience with the PSP Go is a perfect example of why physical games should always be an option. I never owned a PSP until now, and I didn't have a way to download any PSP games because the online store shut down. But there is a loophole. If you download a PSP game on your PS3 or Vita, you just have to connect the PSP to one of those consoles and you can get it that way. The only problem is my Wi-Fi encryption does not work with the PSP, which means I had to open a mobile hotspot on my phone and turn off the password just to get it connected. But digital gaming's the future though, right? And honestly, the PSP Go isn't even that comfortable to hold. The nubby little joystick is in an awkward spot, and the R and L buttons are too close to the screen. I genuinely feel awful about this situation, and will probably mod one of the PSPs at some point so it's actually useful, but modding capabilities aren't being considered for this list. 21. PlayStation Classic. Well, at least I can actually play games on this one. And my god, the console's so cute! Look at how tiny it is! I'm such a sucker for mini consoles. You never expect the size difference, and it always makes for a good first impression. But that's about it. A first impression. It comes with 2 controllers, which is actually pretty great, but why on earth aren't these the analog versions? I get it. The PS1 originally launched without them, and most games don't use them, but these have not aged well at all. At least with Nintendo's NES and SNES Classic controllers, those are still fun to use and function well in the modern day. That's not the case with the PlayStation controllers. Oh, and if you were wondering, these Classic controllers are a tiny bit smaller in scale compared to the original, and also a lot lighter. As someone with bigger hands, I wish these were the same size, but it's really not that big of a deal. I love how the ends look exactly the same too, outside of the USB of course. I will say that at the very least, the start and select button feel a lot better to press than the OG versions, so I guess there's that. But of course, I'm obligated to bring up the PAL versions of the games that don't run at the right speed, and the game selection is missing so many key titles like Crash, Tomb Raider, Silent Hill, Spyro, yada yada yada. But how about that lack of an AC adapter? And look, it's not like you don't have one laying around the house somewhere, but did they really need to save pennies just to inconvenience us? For what it is, the PlayStation Classic is fine if you only want to dabble with PlayStation games and never have before. I definitely appreciate that the menu is based off the original PS1 menu, that's a really cool touch, but if you don't mod it and add more games, you only have a selection of 20 to pick from, so there really isn't much here long term. 20. PlayStation. Aw yeah, one of the best console startup screens ever. That sound has this way of raising the hairs on your arms, almost absorbing you into the game you're about to play. It's so basic yet powerful at the same time. This console dominated the market. It released before the Nintendo 64 did and ended up selling over 100 million units. The design is just a basic box, but it has depth for where the CD goes, which was an interesting choice. The buttons feel great to press, by the way. They have a nice firmness to them. So while it was a huge success, there's not much of a reason to go back unless you're nostalgic for the games. And it still has a great library. Some of these include Final Fantasy VII, Gran Turismo, Tekken, Crash Bandicoot, Resident Evil 2, Metal Gear Solid, and Spyro, just to name a few. You could also play audio CDs, which at the time was a killer feature. Now originally, the console came out with a controller without analog sticks. The general design is so iconic that it's still being used to this day, but this first version doesn't feel great to hold. Trying to play 3D games with the D-pad is a little clunky to say the least. but later on they came out with the dual analog controller, which was the same thing but with two nicely sized clickable analog sticks. While these are better, you have to push a button to activate the analog, and some games don't even support that. Something I find a little odd is how close the memory card slot is to the controller. I feel like if you're not paying attention, you could easily pull out the memory card if you're trying to swap out a controller or something. There's also some reported issues of loud ticking, which is a problem with games not being able to load properly. So while it's still a nice system, there's other ways to play PS1 games. 19. PlayStation 1. Wow, Sony is just as good at naming consoles as Microsoft and Nintendo are. I'd almost consider this the Game Boy Micro for Sony, since it released the slimmer version very shortly before the PS2 launched. While I adore the original console, this update looks a lot sleeker, and making it smaller is a big plus for how many consoles I have hooked up already. It also only cost $100 at launch, which even back then was a great value. The controller has a different color scheme too. It's light gray for the shell, and the buttons are a bit brighter. I prefer the original's dark and sharp colors, but this one has its place. There aren't any other changes beyond that. It's interesting to note that the startup screen has a different menu when you don't have a disc in, so that's kinda cool, but the power adapter is a bit obnoxious because look how massive this brick is. I hate when electronics put the brick on the end with the plug. Just put it in the middle where it isn't obtrusive. Unfortunately, mine has the ticking issue I brought up earlier. So even though mine doesn't work properly, I'd still say it's better just for its smaller form factor. 18. PSP Street. Nintendo's budget Wii was the Wii Mini. The PSP has PSP Street. This was sold in the PAL regions only, and a lot of features were removed. There's no Wi-Fi, the speakers are monaural instead of stereo, and there's no microphone. The buttons on the bottom have been changed drastically as well. Instead of distinct physical buttons, it's all one long panel. And while the buttons work, it's not anywhere near as satisfying or easy to push as a normal button. You've probably noticed the brightness button is missing too. Now you have to go into the power save settings menu to adjust the brightness. So obviously, a lot of the features were cut to lower the cost, but you might as well just get one of the regular PSPs. 17. PSP 1000. And speak of the devil, here we've got the original. It competed with the Nintendo DS, which they didn't even come close to toppling, but it still sold 81 million units, which isn't a failure if you ask me. It's still an incredible piece of tech, even to this day. The most unique feature, of course, is UMD. Each game comes on these tiny little discs encased in plastic with a small opening for the laser to read the data, and you just pop them in from the back. I immediately thought of GameCube discs, and funny enough, they're actually smaller in size. While it's kind of incredible that they got a disc system working on a handheld, it probably wasn't the greatest idea. The disc makes loud spinning noises sometimes, and it's like this for every PSP. The spinning sound isn't the end of the world, but it's a little distracting sometimes. Playing games on this is pretty comfortable for the most part. It feels really nice in the hands, but there's a couple drawbacks for every PSP variant. The biggest one, of course, being the little joystick. I like the addition of having one for 3D games, but the build quality is pretty mediocre. My finger feels like it's slipping all the time. The core's texture just doesn't have enough friction, and these things break pretty easily. All of my joysticks are a little squeaky and have lost their smoothness when making turns. I know that comes with age, but it does make playing 3D games a little annoying. What the PSP has that the DS doesn't is all the multimedia features. I personally don't care for these things in game consoles, but their inclusion back in the day was pretty remarkable. You got a fully functional web browser, remote play with the PS3, storage for photos and music, and you can even watch movies. Yep, you can straight up buy UMD movies. I got Big Daddy to try it out because that's all that was at the store. And you know, the movie quality was actually pretty solid considering how old the PSP is now. Nowadays, all this multimedia stuff is easily accessible on your phone or computer, so they don't have much use anymore. But for what the PSP did, it's a really sleek and unforgettable fella. 16. PSP 2000, or some called it the slim version. It's much lighter and even has more internal storage for the system software. The 1000 was rocking a massive 32 megabytes, while the 2000 has 64 megabytes. This extra space improves the loading times a little bit too. Since it's lighter, playing games for long periods of times is easier to do. To insert UMDs, you have to pull the slot open instead of using an eject switch, and they made the opening much easier for insertion. Also, the buttons are apparently more responsive, but I didn't really notice a difference. So overall it is better, but software-wise it runs and functions basically the same. 15. PSP 3000. Looking at the 2000 and 3000, it's really hard to tell the differences. But there's actually a few improvements, with the main one being a brighter LCD screen with a wider color range. It's also a teeny tiny bit smaller, but you won't be able to spot that as the differences are near negligible. The logo and a couple of buttons look slightly different as well, and that's about it. It's one of the most minor upgrades I think I've ever seen with a handheld. Well, outside of maybe the Game Boy Advance SP getting an upgrade with a brighter screen, and nothing else. 14. PlayStation TV. This is a wonderful idea on paper. The ability to play PS Vita games on the big screen is a great idea, and it's also backwards compatible with anything you can buy in the PlayStation Store. But wait, I'm not able to add money to the PlayStation Store anymore. And only some PS Vita games are compatible. You heard me right, only some of them. Logically, that makes sense because the Vita has the touchscreen and touchpad on the back, and you can't obviously emulate that with a PS3 controller, which was originally the only controller that worked with the PS TV. They eventually added support for the PS4 controller so you could use the touch bar to emulate the touchscreen games, but that didn't help much with the bizarre compatibility issues. I purchased 4 PS Vita games for this video, and I can play a total of 0 of them. Why doesn't Monkey Ball work? All I'm doing is using a joystick. But lucky for me, there's already some games preloaded from the previous owner, so I could at least try it out. And I gotta admit, I had a good time with it. I didn't really notice any input lag, and the visuals look pretty nice on the screen. Hardware-wise, I really like the small form factor, but there's no rubber feet. That's kind of a big issue when the device is so light. That makes it really easy to get knocked around. I am so conflicted on the PS TV because it has so much potential and it's a cool idea, but the fact that I can only load up some PS Vita games makes this worth very little unless you mod it. 13. PS Vita, the console that unfortunately did not get the support it deserved and ended up flopping. A measly 10 to 15 million in sales is pretty awful for how jam-packed the Vita is, and it's too bad because it's a beautiful piece of technology. The joysticks have been vastly improved for one. You actually have a pretty good grip on them, and they don't slip out of your hands during use. There's an OLED touchscreen with a much higher resolution, 2 cameras and a microphone, motion controls, a touchpad on the back screen, and PS Vita games revert back to cards, which looks strangely similar to the Switch's cards. But yeah, there are so many upgrades over the PSP. The menu UI is really slick too. Now, there's a couple reasons why the Vita didn't really take off. One of the smaller ones is the proprietary memory cards. At this point in time, SD cards were very common for portable storage purposes and still are, but Sony wanted to cash in and made their own PS Vita specific cards. This is a huge pain in the neck for people that wanted to download a lot of games. It was completely unnecessary to make it this way. The biggest reason for the Vita's financial failure is just that Sony didn't make a lot of games for it. It's almost like they sent it out to die. And honestly, the games that they did make were really similar to what's already on the PS3 and PS4. I played Uncharted Golden Abyss, and while I was really impressed and having a good time, I was kind of wondering why I wasn't just playing Uncharted on PS4. The point of a handheld is to play games that are more catered to on the go, or at least that's how it used to be. And of course, there were a lot of games like that, but so many of the AAA titles were just watered down versions of what's already on the console. I mean, just look at the top 5 selling games: Uncharted Golden Abyss, Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, Little Big Planet PS Vita, and Persona 4 The Golden. With that said, the PS Vita store is pretty awesome and surprisingly still up today. There's a bunch of indie games on there, as well as PS1 classics and PSP games. So there's definitely value with that despite it being harder to add money, but games from other consoles should complement the library, not overtake it. 12. PS Vita 2nd Gen, a thinner and lighter PS Vita. It replaces the OLED screen with LCD, which allows for an extra hour or so of battery life. While the screen might not look quite as good, it's still fantastic and isn't that substantial of a downgrade. The only other change is how the console is charged. It switches to using a more traditional micro USB. While that's nice and all, they should have added SD card support on top of that, which frankly it might have been too late to make that change as compatibility with the other Vita might have been a problem, but adding 2 different slots would have been appreciated. I also really like the start and select buttons. They're a little bit bigger and just better in general. There's no reason to not go with the slim model over the original, unless you really care about the OLED screen. 11. PlayStation 2. This was the first console I purchased specifically for YouTube over a decade ago, so my experience with it is very different to many others. In case you live under a rock, the PS2 is the best-selling game console of all time, topping off at 155 million units sold. God damn, that is absolutely bonkers. And funny enough, a lot of people weren't buying this for the games. The PS2 was able to play DVDs, which was a huge deal when the console launched. DVDs were taking off like crazy in the 2000s, and buying a PlayStation 2 was a great value since it could play DVDs, PS2 games, and it was backwards compatible with PS1 games. That means the PS2 could play over 10,000 games. Even the PS1 memory cards work. The original design of the console is very different to the PlayStation 1. It's a wide black box with a smaller chunk on the bottom. It's definitely a bulky guy, but it also has 2 USB ports, which was a very new thing for consoles. Something I learned is that there were limited edition PS2s with wacky colors. Why the hell didn't we get this? I want that bright yellow one. That looks freaking sick. The controller also feels a bit more premium. They didn't add much to it, but there wasn't really a reason to. The start and select buttons feel less mushy, which is a nice change, and vibration is included as well as pressure-sensitive buttons. Hell, you could even connect online, but you needed a network adapter for that to work. The games themselves are pretty incredible, with titles like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Final Fantasy X, Jak and Daxter, God of War, and so many more. The PS2 is a juggernaut in carving out the gaming landscape, and set a standard with what a top-selling console looks like. 10. PlayStation 2 Slim. I cannot believe how tiny this thing is, and the disc drive opens from the top. I don't know why I'm so fascinated with consoles that do this. I just like the analog feel of plopping in a disc and closing it up securely. Playing online was a lot easier too, since the networking ports are built into the console. It's pretty much the exact same as the regular PS2, but a lot smaller. The only main thing that's missing is the expansion bay, so there isn't an internal hard drive, but for the sheer tiny size, it more than makes up for it. 9. PSX. By far the heaviest console I've ever held in my life. This thing weighs in at a whopping 13 pounds. It does everything a PlayStation can do, and it's also a DVR. You've probably never seen this console before, because it only came out in Japan and is forgotten about nowadays. It also comes with a remote, and dude, this thing is pretty awesome. Look at that little joystick. So precious. Hell, you can link a PSP to this guy and transfer photos, videos, and music. That is insane to me. This box can do just about anything. And the menus use the cross-media bar UI. It's so interesting to see this UI carry over to so many different PlayStation consoles. The only disadvantage is just its sheer size. It's not very living room friendly, as it'll take up a lot of space on your shelf. You also have to hook your controller up to the back, and the memory cards are in the front, which is super odd. There are a ton of inputs back here. The components are used for either the PS2 or DVR, and it's also region locked, but that's to be expected from most older consoles. But man, this beast is such a cool piece of history. It reminds me a lot of Nintendo's Panasonic Q. 8. PlayStation 3 Slim. We've finally gotten to a PlayStation console that I've actually put a lot of time into. The PS3 Slim introduced me to Call of Duty, Tetris, Minecraft, The Last of Us, and HD graphics. The switch from 480p on the Wii to 1080p on PS3 was mind-boggling. It's really hard to find words to explain how amazing the jump was when you spent the first 16 years of your life only having things like the Game Boy, N64, and GameCube. The Slim model had a lot more hard drive space compared to the original, and it was desperately needed considering downloading entire games was becoming more and more common. Models were going from 120 to 320 gigabytes, which back in the day was a decent amount. There's also 2 different controllers, the 6-axis and DualShock 3. Both controllers are similar, but the main difference is the DualShock is heavier, much more durable, and includes rumble. Both controllers are also wireless, which is an awesome upgrade, but can be plugged in for wired play if you're looking for that. I really like how a PS3 controller feels in your hands. The ergonomics were starting to get really good with this variation. While you can still play DVDs, Blu-ray support was added in, which is what PS3 games run off of. The biggest downgrade with the PS3 Slim and Super Slim is the fact that PS2 games are no longer backwards compatible. That really takes a big toll on the console. Losing a library that large is pretty brutal. But at least PS1 games still work, and you can buy PS2 games off the store. Well, at least until the store is up. Sony will probably take it down in the next few years, despite the backlash they had recently. One of the most annoying annoying things about all the PS3s is how often you had to update your console. It's almost as bad as Steam, if not worse. Like seriously, as a teenager, I'd log in a few times a week and almost every time I had to update. The store itself was also super laggy, but that might have just been my internet speeds at the time. And it's also free, so I can't complain that much. You've also got options to manage photos and videos, but I never found much incentive to utilize this stuff. The game library is pretty incredible too, and I haven't even played that much of it. You've got Grand Theft Auto 5, the Batman Arkham series, the Uncharted series, Dark Souls, Red Dead Redemption, and that's just a tiny amount of what's out there. I've had so many good memories with the PS3, and it's aged surprisingly well. 7. PlayStation 3 Super Slim. It's another PS3, but even smaller. They call it Super Slim, but honestly, it's still pretty beefy. Some key differences is the inclusion of larger storage options and a different way of inserting discs. The disc tray opens up from the top. You can slide it open with your hands or push a button. The materials do feel a little on the cheap side, but I definitely prefer consoles that let you physically take discs out like this. I've got an Xbox 360 with Sonic 06 trapped in it because the disc tray won't open. That would never be a problem with the Super Slim, but that's really about it. Again, I find the smaller consoles a little more appealing. 6. PlayStation 4. For the most part, we basically just go in order for the rest of this list. The one big downside about the PS4 is that it isn't backwards compatible with any PlayStation 1 through 3 games. But at this point, it's getting more and more unrealistic to expect that, so I get it. What I do have a concern for is disc games. They're no longer played off a disc, but instead are entirely downloaded onto the hard drive, which takes up a lot of space. This is just a little concerning for the future of games and their longer usability and preservation, but for the time being, it's not that big a deal outside of waiting for games to download all the content the first time, and once they are downloaded, you're good to go outside of the occasional update. Speaking of updates, the PS4 doesn't get nearly as many. They occur much less frequently. The games themselves look better than ever, even with the resolution remaining at 1080p. You'll notice the games run a lot smoother and have much better textures and lighting effects. The difference isn't quite as big compared to the PS2 and PS3, but it's still enough to be noticeable. The load times are also faster than on PS3, and the controller is so much better. They finally revamped it while keeping the same shape. The ergonomics have been refined even more and are somehow more comfortable to hold and grip. The shoulder buttons feel so nice. R2 and L2 have these little grooves that makes pushing those buttons more seamless. Even the joysticks have these little grooves so your thumb won't slip as easily. The extra attention to detail really paid off. As for new features, you can plug headphones into the new controller, and the start and select button will replace with a touch bar, option button, and share button. The touch bar still looks weird to me. You'll use it as a massive button or a touchscreen, but it's not as intuitive as you'd think. Trying to type with it is not fluid at all. The option button is basically the start button now, and the share button lets you take video clips or screenshots and upload them. That is a huge part of the PS4, being able to more easily share your gameplay with your friends or the world. You can also live stream, which is neat, but I'd rather just use OBS for that. All these new features are very much appreciated. Heck, even the menu UI is a massive upgrade. It's much easier to locate where things are, and you won't be scrolling through dozens of submenus anymore. Plus, it's region-free, and you can connect with the PS Vita. So I really dig what the PS4 brings to the table. However, there's two more things to discuss: PlayStation Plus and PlayStation Now. Two different subscription services. Thinking about subscribing to another service is making my mind numb, but I'll give Sony credit. They give you a decent amount of value with PlayStation Plus. You get a full free game every month and discounts on games, so that's not too bad. But you also have to pay for cloud storage and online multiplayer, which kinda sucks. But I get it. This stuff costs a lot to keep running. PlayStation Now, on the other hand, is the biggest waste of money to me. It's a way to stream PlayStation games, and I've never tried that until now. I've got a pretty good internet connection, so the game was running perfectly fine and all, but the games don't last for forever. They all rotate and only stick around for like 3 to 6 months. You can download them to your console too, but what's the point if I can't keep the game? PlayStation Now is basically a virtual blockbuster, and that's perfectly fine and all. It's just not for me since I like owning the things I pay for. There's a lot to say about the PS4. It changed a lot of things I dislike, but overall, it's one of the better PlayStation consoles. 5. PlayStation 4 Slim. It's the PS4 still, but a little bit smaller. I guess I never mentioned the box at all, but both of them have this really strange tilt to them. It really stands out amongst other consoles and looks kinda cool, and they did the same thing with this version. They also updated the USB slots to support 3.1 and added Bluetooth 4.0 and much better Wi-Fi. The only thing that was removed was the optical output, but that's hardly a big deal for most people. It also consumes slightly less power, but still plays games the same. 4. PlayStation 4 Pro. Wow, it's another PS4. But compared to every other console variant for Sony consoles, this one actually upgrades the GPU and CPU. The specs are a lot higher, so games can run in 4K, use HDR, and load faster. So honestly, if you can't find a PS5 like everyone else at the time of this recording, then this is fairly comparable to that. Speaking of... 3. PlayStation 5 Digital. I didn't even believe the PS5 was real until I saw it myself, and I'm only half joking because as of right now, they're still very hard and expensive to get. Ranking a brand new console is tricky because we don't know how good its library is going to be, but I think the PS5 could end up being absolutely legendary by the end of its cycle. First things first, this controller is next level. I thought the DualShock 4 was a great upgrade, but they actually made it more comfortable to hold and added features they didn't steal from Nintendo. The new feature we gotta talk about is the adaptive triggers. They have real-time haptic feedback with the game you're playing, which admittedly, it's very hard to explain without trying it yourself. So let's simplify things. Imagine you're trying to pull a car door open. To do this, you have to apply force to the handle to open it. This creates resistance from this. The PS5 triggers are able to apply this same kind of resistance. A good example is shooting a gun. You can feel a real pull and force on the actual button, and let me tell you, it is absolutely incredible. That is technology I wouldn't have even been able to conceive. Astro's Playroom is the game the PS5 is bundled with, and it does an amazing job demonstrating how the controller works. As for the console itself, it looks odd. Some people think it looks awful, but I love the design. And don't think I'm not agreeing with the haters, it looks stupid as shit. But that's what makes it special. I'm never gonna forget that the PS5 looks like a freaking network router. You gotta love its absurd style. But if you look closer at the console, you'll notice that the texture consists of the classic PlayStation buttons. You can even use your PS4 controller with the PS5, but you can only play PS4 games on it, which is fine because it's backwards compatible with like 99% of the library, and a lot of times PS4 games will load much faster thanks to the upgrade in the hardware. Gone are the hard drives. Everything's now running through SSDs and M.2s, which drastically improve the loading speeds. It's almost like the old days of popping in an N64 cartridge and the game just starts. We're actually returning to that era. The UI is also improved yet again, this time doing a better job splitting up the games and media into two different sections. You'll notice that there's zero lag compared to the PS4's menu. Swapping between apps is impressively seamless. PlayStation Plus also offers this new game help feature, which can give you help on the spot you're stuck at in a game. I don't know how that adds any value when you can easily look up the answer for free, but it's an attempt at offering value, I guess. Once the PS5 can be found in stores, I think more people will really appreciate the sheer power it brings. 2. PlayStation 5 Standard. It's the exact same thing, but it has a disc drive. You can tell that Sony wasn't planning on making the PS5 with discs, because it awkwardly sticks out on the side while the digital version is perfectly symmetrical. I'm honestly really glad they're still doing discs, even if they're just DRM at this point and you're playing off the console. I can at least easily carry the game around to other consoles, plus you've got DVD, Blu-ray, and Ultra HD Blu-ray playback as a bonus. 1. PlayStation 3. Assuming you get the first generation model, the original PS3 is capable of playing PS3, PS2, and PS1 games. That level of backwards compatibility is just incredible, and I really wish it was carried over throughout every variant of the PS3. That means you just need this and a PS5 to be able to play just about every PlayStation game out there. The touch buttons for power and ejecting the disc are pretty cool too. Now, the initial launch and price point may have not been its best moment,
$599 US.
but once the console was out for a while, it ended up creating a really impressive library, and the fat version is the best one to boot. This was also the only console that allows you to play super audio CDs, by the way. I don't have one to try just because the technology flopped and didn't really think about getting it, but it goes to show just how much this console's capable of. It may be a pretty large boy, but it is well worth it for the insanely large list of games you can play on it. Well, hot mama, was that a lot of new stuff to learn, but it was a lot of fun diving into the PlayStation world for a little bit. The PlayStation controller has kept its iconic look for over 20 years, but there's also a bunch of wonky ones that we've all forgotten about. So I'll be taking a look at them all and seeing which ones have aged the best and are the most practical. So with that, let's get her ranked. 23. SingStar Microphone. This mic was published by Sony, so yeah, I'm gonna count it. And maybe I just have an old and broken mic, but this thing is a piece of junk. I tried it with Rock Band, and it should have worked perfectly fine, but nope, I had to scream into the mic just for it to pick up my voice at all. I remember this being a problem with other Rock Band mics as a teenager as well, but the fact that it barely responds at all kinda sucks. And to further add to the pile, it is just a microphone, so it's only gonna work with singing games. Plus, it's not advanced enough to recognize what you're saying. The only thing this mic responds to is how loud and how soft your voice is. So if you wanted, you could just yell the whole time and get the same results. It's just a basic ass mic. You're not gonna get much out of this. 22. PSX Remote. Yep, I'm even including remotes because they're technically controllers. You can control things with them. There's something really cool about seeing the classic PlayStation buttons on the remote itself, but it is quite literally just a remote. I like this little nub in the middle. It's kind of fun to mess with, but really, you're getting what you'd expect from this. You control DVDs. Yippee. 21. PS2 DVD Remote Control. Now that's what you call a thick remote, and you might think that I'm grasping at straws here trying to find things to talk about, but seriously, go look at the rest of the remotes in your house and tell me this isn't the widest one you've ever seen. The PS2 remote also has the PlayStation buttons and functions the same as the PSX one. The only reason I'm ranking it higher is because the PS2 runs on American DVDs while the PSX doesn't. So these two controllers could be interchanged depending on where you're from. 20. PS3 Remote Control. Once again, it's another remote which works the same as all the other ones. Its shape is moderately more comfortable to hold, and it has a bit more features, one of those being the ability to switch from 2D and 3D modes on your TV, and it was also compatible with services like Netflix. Plus, it's got colored buttons: red, blue, yellow, green. But what the hell do they do? Well, even after checking the manual, I still have no idea. The manual says, and I quote, "perform functions assigned to each button." Wow, well that was useful. Thanks, Sony. No, but apparently these buttons do different things depending on what you're watching. Weird. 19. PS5 Media Remote. How did Sony manage to make this remote look so appealing? Some people may not like the small form factor, but I honestly think it's fantastic and fits really nicely in the hand. My only real gripe with it is the lack of rubber on the bottom, making it really easy to slip around. But the buttons here are simplified and easy to understand. And I really love the big streaming service ones like Disney+, Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube. It's gonna be hilarious if in 20 years, any of these services are gone and they're ingrained in the remote for forever. This is just a really solid remote. It's one of the prettiest ones I own, as if that means anything to anybody here. Maybe it does. Anyone else collect remotes like I do? Anyone? 18. Buzz Buzzers. Yep, this is also an official Sony controller since the game it was made for was published by Sony. I won't say much about the game, but if you're curious, it's basically just this quiz thing where the host is a massive jackass. But as for the controllers themselves, well, it's about as simple as it gets. A big red button and some colored rectangles underneath. It's uniform in nature, meaning that if you're right or left-handed, you can use this pretty easily. And the buttons have a nice clickiness to them. The size feels nice, and it grips well in your hand. The red button even lights up and blinks, so it's one of the few controllers that's ready to party. There's also a wireless version of this controller, but I only have the wired ones on hand. While the Buzz Buzzer controllers are pretty solid overall, they aren't compatible with like 99.9% of games and really only serve a purpose for this goofy quiz game. 17. PlayStation Eye. The majority of people consider this as a part of the PlayStation Move, which we'll get to later on. But as for the camera itself, there's a tiny handful of games exclusively for the PlayStation Eye. And it's basically the same experience as the iToy, but the camera is better and I guess it's more responsive. There's two different modes for this camera. The modes you can switch from are this red side and this blue side. So what's the difference exactly? Well, funny enough, this mechanic functions the same as a normal camera would when twisting the lens. The field of view gets switched, so the red side has a smaller view while the blue is bigger. PlayStation Eye comes with iCreate, which was a video editing software right on your PS3. So while that's neat and all, I don't see why anybody would bother using this camera in the current age. And I really don't like that you can't move the camera around on the stand. It's forced to point at the ground, which is so stupid. For the time, it was novel, but like with the iToy, it serves virtually no purpose today. 16. iToy, or in other words, the original Kinect. The iToy came out in 2003, so as you'd expect, the camera quality is absolutely atrocious. But that doesn't really matter because it still works. In fact, it works pretty well. Now, I've got iToy Play 1 and 2, so I tried those games out and was pleasantly surprised with how responsive the iToy is. There were a lot of games I tried that were fun, but after a while, it all kind of feels like the same thing. Just wave your arms around and hit the enemies on screen. That's pretty much what most of the games get boiled down to. And that can be very exhausting after a while. It is kind of cool how you're on the screen at all times, but you can only do so much with the iToy. While it's a mostly worthless novelty, it's also a charming one. 15. PS1 D-pad, the most classic OG PlayStation controller. It honestly has not held up as well as Nintendo's classics. The design is iconic and is still fairly comfortable to hold, but the button quality is fairly mixed. While the face buttons feel alright, the D-pad has never felt that great, and I think the issue is that each direction button feels disconnected. The NES and SNES D-pads work so well because they're all one giant button, and it's easy to swing your finger around the entire thing. But on this controller, it's more challenging to do, and it also doesn't help that there's a ton of 3D games on the PS1. A D-pad is not going to make those fun to play no matter which way you swing it, which is why they updated the controller later on. But even to this day, they've stuck with this type of D-pad, which I honestly don't understand. I mean, I guess it stands out amongst everyone else, but it just feels inferior. 14. PlayStation Classic D-pad. It might seem redundant to count these as two different controllers, but there are a few notable differences that make it slightly better. The biggest one being the start and select buttons. They're a lot less mushy to press down on. They also have a slightly smaller form factor, and the end is a USB, which is more convenient in today's age. It's still bizarre to me that the PlayStation Classic chose to go with this version of the controller considering it's objectively worse than the newer version with analog joysticks, but I digress. 13. PS1 Analog Flight Joysticks. Look at this absolute hog of a controller. This thing is twice the size of the PlayStation itself, and shockingly, it's held up well. The flight sticks were a bit of a concern when I first saw it, but they're actually incredibly responsive. Now, I should note that I don't have any flight games to try this with, so I just threw up Spyro as a test. And I was actually having a lot of fun moving around with these sticks. The range of motion is huge, and it has actual sensitivity. You can move precisely or thrust forward at full power. It accurately reads all of your movements. There's also a conglomerate amount of buttons on this thing, and while it may look like a cluster, they're all mapped in a way that makes sense. You've got buttons on the front of the stick, a tiny joystick nub on the right, multiple on the back, and a bunch on the board itself. The buttons on the board have a nice clicky feel. Heck, you can even turn off the analog if you really want to. The start and select buttons are still pretty squishy, which again, I'm not a fan of, but I guess it's a design choice Sony wanted to stick with. What I find fascinating is that for some games, the controller accommodates right and left-handed players. If you want to move around a game with your right thumb, you can use the joystick and then the big buttons with your left hand. The only drawback is that it's not going to be as precise as a normal controller, but if you want to play a flight game, then this is the real deal. Well, I'd imagine it is, but again, I couldn't try a flight game. I am really impressed with how well this controller has stood the test of time. 12. PS1 DualShock. We finally got into the first controller that's likely the most familiar to you. It's the same as the older version, but with these nice comfortable joysticks. Now you can properly control your 3D games. Wow! And better, you can click the joysticks in, which was an idea that was pretty ahead of its time. The materials and size they used are really nice too. They're firm and have a slight amount of texturing so your thumb won't slip. It's funny going back and seeing the N64's joystick compared to this. Like, my god, what a glow up this is. It still looks and feels premium even 19 years later. 11. PS1 Dual Analog. Here's a controller that you might, but also might not be familiar with. If you look closely at the joysticks, you'll notice it's got a slightly different shape. In case you don't know the difference between concave and convex thumbsticks, this one has a concave shape. That simply means that the middle of the joystick dips down into a bowl-like shape, creating a natural spot for your thumb to rest in. Is this better than the convex design most people use today? It's really up to preference. I'm personally indifferent to what feels better. Honestly, the real reason I like this controller more is the longer handles. Side by side, it's only a couple inches longer, but it fits in your hand so much nicer. But again, your hand size is the ultimate factor here. But for me, this feels a lot better to hold. 10. DualShock 2. Most people take one look at this thing and don't notice any differences to the first DualShock. The PS2's DualShock 2 is virtually identical externally. All I can really point out is that there's a lot more color options to pick from. I mean, just look at my translucent red one. It still looks really nice to this day. Internally speaking, it's a little bit lighter, which I guess is a nice bonus, but the first controller wasn't necessarily heavy to begin with. The main difference is the pressure-sensitive buttons. These can be used to better control acceleration in a racing game, as an example. I think it's a super interesting idea to have this as an option, but the buttons themselves have barely any range to begin with. That makes it hard to really feel the difference in the games that support this feature, especially since you get no feedback on the amount of pressure you're actually applying, which in turn make your thumb sore if you're pressing hard for long periods of time. It's really interesting that this exists on such old tech, and it's even in the DualShock 3, but it isn't really utilized in PS3 games. 9. PlayStation Move Motion/Navigation. Man, oh man, am I conflicted on this controller. On one hand, it's clearly a Wii Remote knockoff that adds a colorful orb at the top to stand out, but on the other hand, I had a decent time using these. The controller itself is pretty comfortable to hold, the buttons feel good to press, and the trigger on the back is nice and soft. Everything is reachable aside from start and select, but that's probably for the best since you'll rarely need to hit those anyway. The shape of the Move controllers are much more smooth than the rigged Wiimote, which is kinda nice, and they also come with straps. But of course, I'll point out the oddball in the room, this orb looks really goofy, but when it starts lighting up different colors, it really brings the controller to life. Even when they're used with the first VR headset, the Move controllers work fairly well, but for now, we're just going to talk about the controller itself. The way it works is you have to calibrate it with the PlayStation Eye. So it's kind of like the Wii sensor bar, but much more obnoxious because you have to manually calibrate the positioning yourself. The tracking uses Bluetooth and the positioning is retained from the light of the orbs, which means that for the best experience, you have to play in the dark or in a dimly lit room. I tried playing iPet and Killzone 3 with these controllers and it works fine. iPet was it was a video game for like 10 minutes, all I gotta say about that. And then Killzone 3 was fun until the motion controls became unbearable due to it being clunkier than just using a joystick. I think the biggest issue with a motion controller is the fact that there's no joystick or even a D-pad, and the camera we have to use it with sucks. Why not use a newer camera? Or better yet, an infrared sensor bar like Nintendo did? But yeah, there's the navigation controller, which is like the motion one, but with a joystick and no squishy orb. I guess it's handy that you don't have to plug this into the motion controller, unlike the nunchuck with the Wiimote. So while the motion tracking works pretty well, let's just be real, you might as well just use a DualShock 3. Most of the games revolving around PlayStation Move are gimmicky and boring, but the tech is competent at the very least. 8. PlayStation VR Aim. Okay, you can't tell me that this isn't a cue ball rack, or the Wii Zapper with a dot on the end. Design-wise, it's one of those things where you kinda just laugh at it. As for its functionality though, I didn't really know what to expect. But then I tried a couple of shooting games out, Farpoint and Firewall Zero Hour, and I have to admit, I was impressed with how accurate it ended up being. The trigger buttons feel great, and the buttons on the controller are very easy to reach. Normally, I'd hate the idea of this many buttons on a toy gun, but the way they've been placed just makes a lot of sense. The dual joysticks are where your thumbs are already gonna be, the trigger buttons feel great to push, and everything else is easily reachable. There are a couple of buttons on the side that take some effort to push, but you'll never need them when playing the games themselves. The main issue comes down to a lack of killer apps in VR, but this is still very early tech, so they'll come over time. 7. PlayStation VR. Okay, so technically the VR headset itself isn't a controller, but it's used in conjunction with the PlayStation Move controllers, and I don't know when the heck I'll ever talk about this again with the PSVR 2 out. But yeah, if you've been following me for a while, you may know that I spent 24 hours in the HTC Vive headset playing Mario 64. Beyond that, I've played Beat Saber and Tetris in VR, and that's about it. Like I said earlier, still waiting for more killer apps to make VR worth investing my time into. to. But since doing that stupid Mario 64 video, there has been some good stuff that's come out, like Half-Life Alyx as an example, but I still feel like there's a couple of big problems with VR that need to be addressed. On to the PSVR itself. You use the PS3's goofy motion controls and the PS4 camera to connect everything together. Setting up is pretty easy, and the games that I tried out worked pretty competently. There are a lot of cables, and you need to get this extra box to get it running, but they make the process very simple, and the only cord you'll have nearby is one attached to the headset. The headset itself is pretty comfortable, but it's not perfect. If you look down, you'll see your feet instead of just darkness. And the games get pretty blurry if you don't have it positioned correctly. It's nice to have these buttons attached to the cord for volume, and it has a spot to plug in headphones so you can get really immersed. The resolution isn't super high either, but it's high enough to where you still feel like you're really there. So I tried a few games out, but the only one I got really into was Super Hot VR. I'm sure a lot of you already know what this is, but in case you don't, it's a shooter/stealth game where time moves when you move. So you have to survive and defeat the polygon dudes while avoiding their bullets and attacks. Because you move your entire body and the game moves at your pace, it feels incredible and very natural to play. But there's also moments where the motion controllers stop tracking and get thrown off. But for the most part, I really felt like I was in the world and it was amazing. However, the other VR games didn't work as well. I'll just bring up Farpoint as an example. You move around with a joystick and then physically aim at the aliens you're shooting at. It looks great and is incredibly immersive, but because my body isn't physically moving with the game, my brain gets very confused, and after like 30 minutes, I gotta take a break. That's an issue with most VR games. And look, I play a lot of games, and even I was getting nauseous. I'm not sure how this problem is going to be solved, but VR hardware/software devs have got to figure this out or it's never going to take off mainstream. The headset itself looks pretty sleek, but let's be honest, you look like a dork wearing this thing. The design of the headset has got to be reduced in size drastically to look like a pair of glasses before more people will be willing to try it. But even with all that said, Super Hot really made me see a bright future for this technology. It's only going to get better from here. Normal controllers are still way better, but VR is very fun in small doses. 6. PlayStation VR 2. The amount of improvements in Sony's newest VR headset is kind of insane. The first thing to mention is just how simple and easy it is to set up. You see this USB-C cord? You plug that into your PS5 and you're basically done. No more obnoxious box with 5 different cables. It all somehow works through just one cable. You also don't need a camera anymore for tracking. The headset scans your playroom and it remembers unless you move out of the room. But now let's move on to the VR DualSense controllers. They kind of look like freak controllers of the future, but this is 2023, so we're basically at that point now. They're honestly quite comfortable to hold, and all the buttons and joysticks feel great in the hands. You've also got wrist straps to accompany these. The only drawback might be that people with large hands wouldn't like the smaller buttons and joystick. The screen in the VR has a much wider field of view, it's an OLED in 4K, plus looking down no longer shows your feet. Simply putting this headset on is easier than the first one too. You push this button on the top to slide your head in and then twist the back to tighten. You've also got a camera that you can turn on at any time, so if you need to look around the room you're in or take a break from playing, you can do that without taking the headset off. But what about the PSVR games? Well, unfortunately, the ones on PS4 aren't compatible with this headset. I completely understand why that's so, considering how much more advanced the headset and controllers are, but it's still a bummer, and I hope that the PSVR devs upgrade their games to work on PS5. So for now, we can only play PSVR 2 games, and there's a few that I picked up. Of course I got Tetris because I'm obsessed, but I also grabbed Thumper, Resident Evil 8, and Horizon Call of the Mountain. Horizon does a good job showcasing the power of the headset, and while it was really immersive and didn't have any issues with accurately displaying the controllers, my problem still comes down to the type of game it is. When you're moving from place to place but standing still in reality, your brain just isn't gonna like that. I know that some people don't get dizzy from these kinds of VR games, but I'm still not used to it, and I honestly don't know if I ever will be. Resident Evil 8 was again an incredibly cool showcase, but the exact same issue applies here too. I had a good time with Thumper at least, since the VR effects were mostly in the background and I remained stationary. But yeah, I'm incredibly impressed with how much this second headset improves over the first one. 5. 6-axis. Sony's first wireless controller. The convenience of getting rid of the wire automatically makes it better than its wired counterparts. The design itself remains the same, but there's some notable changes. Instead of the analog button, it's replaced with the PlayStation logo, which brings up the PS3 menu at any time. The R2 and L2 buttons also have way more range and can be squeezed down. These feel amazing and are much better than what the PS1 and 2 controllers have. The curvature lip is also much less defined, which I feel like makes a huge difference. On the PS1 and 2, this lip forces your fingers to awkwardly rest on the shoulder buttons, while on the PS3, they rest more naturally between R1 and R2. Also a fun fact, this controller can be paired with a PSP Go. For the 2000s, that's a neat feature. The reason this is called the 6-axis controller is because it has motion sensing technology where you can tilt the controller to do specific things in a game. This is nothing new nowadays. The Wii was all about this, and this is just Sony's version of that. What's strange though is the lack of vibration. This controller just doesn't have that at all. Some people probably don't care, but I feel like it adds to the game, so it's weird to not have it included. The analog joysticks are also more precise than the DualShock 2's, and it uses analog and digital signals simultaneously. So it once again improves on its previous iteration, and it only gets better from here. 4. DualShock 3. As you'd expect, this is strikingly similar to the 6-axis controller, but it has rumble and haptic feedback included. So it's got all the great stuff from each previous DualShock all wrapped into one. There's really not much else to add beyond that. The 6-axis is pretty obsolete when the DualShock 3 exists. 3. DualShock 4. Holy hell, this is one heck of a glow up. The amount of upgrades this controller got while still maintaining the iconic shape is pretty crazy. To start, the biggest difference is of course the massive touch bar button. At first, I didn't really care much for it and kind of missed having start and select, but now that I've used this in the DualSense a bunch, I think the change made a lot of sense. That's because it can be used as multiple buttons, and it's even a touchscreen if you really want to use that. The L2 and R2 buttons are even better now. They're a tiny bit narrower and have this subtle lip at the end. These two changes make pushing the shoulder buttons feel great and removes any slipperiness. The joysticks, however, do something that I haven't really seen. The edges cave inside while the middle retains the classic convex shape. It's a super interesting idea, which basically gives you the best of both concave and convex shapes. Then we've got the light bar. This flashes different colors depending on what's going on in your game. The light bar adds personality to the DualShock 4. It looks pretty sweet when it's lit up, and there's even a bunch of basic stuff that was included, like a headphone jack, speakers, and proper motion sensors. Even the handles are longer again, like with the PS1's dual analog. With the size of my hands, it's much more comfortable to grasp. The start and select buttons have been replaced with the share and option buttons too, which I think makes sense in today's age. We post random stuff on social media all the time, so there might as well be a dedicated button to make that easier to do. 2. DualSense. If there's one reason to buy a PlayStation 5, it's for the controller. I know that sounds crazy, but seriously, Sony absolutely knocked it out of the park this generation. It builds off the DualShock 4 and manages to improve on almost everything. It has a much more weighty feel than the DualShock 4. The build quality just feels more premium. The light bar is now behind the touch button on the edges, so you still get the features in a more subtle way. The buttons feel very solid and concrete, and they kept all the good stuff like the creative joystick shape, headphone jack, and speaker. The two biggest inclusions are the haptic feedback and adaptive triggers. Instead of a typical rumble motor, there is dual actuators which create vibrations that feel much more realistic to what's happening on screen. But the biggest feature is of course how the L2 and R2 buttons function. They have different levels of force feedback and tension depending on what part of the game you're playing. So if you're playing something like The Last of Us, you'll feel different levels of tension whether you're shooting a pistol or a bow and arrow. It's one of those things where you have to physically feel how it works to get a full grasp on how amazing it is. And to top it off, it uses USB-C to charge. Not that that's surprising or anything. I'm just glad that Sony's kept up with the times because it's by far the easiest charger we've ever had to use. And my god, I love how this thing looks too. Its style somehow is inspired by the 90s aesthetic, but also manages to look modern. I really love how over the top the PS5 console and controller look. They're gonna stick out years down the line compared to the other consoles this generation. 1. DualSense Edge. Before going into why this is the best PlayStation controller yet, I'm very aware that this thing costs $200, which is absurdly expensive. But my god, Sony really went all out here and made this feel like a $200 controller. It comes with a hard case that looks and feels great. Plus, you can open up the back to charge your controller without taking it out. It's a bit heavier than the regular DualSense, but there's a lot more going on inside to make it work. Firstly, there's a couple of back buttons of different lengths that you can attach to the back. They're pretty easy to set up, although honestly, having 4 shoulder buttons already feels like enough, but I'm sure some people would find a good use for these. The touch bar also looks a lot nicer. The way they stylize the controller gives it an almost mature look, and the adaptive triggers can be adjusted even more. If you don't want to push down as much to get the full press in, you'll just move this switch to do so. And if you miss those classic convex caps, those are very easy to swap out. In fact, you can change the entire joystick if something goes wrong, since the plastic plate can come off. There's also 2 new function buttons, which allow you to remap your buttons and save profiles. While this is nice to have, it's kinda dumb that you can't do this with a normal DualSense, but personally, I don't really care much for this feature to begin with. Even the USB cable is braided and very high quality. You can attach it to your controller and have it lock in place if you want to play it wired. The only real complaint I've heard people talk about is the battery life. It's around 4 to 5 hours, which isn't super long, but realistically, the only people getting this controller are professionals playing a game competitively, and they'll have their controllers wired up for that anyway. Another nice detail that I really appreciate is the slip-resistant inner grips. You feel a very light amount of resistance on the inside, and it actually makes a bit of a difference when playing. With all that said, you probably don't need to own this controller because of the cost, but it still tops the original DualSense due to all the extra stuff we're given. It was really cool going back and trying out all of Sony's experimental technology. In a lot of ways, they kind of remind me of the wacky stuff that Nintendo has attempted after all these decades. Why is the PS5 so big? This thing is a hog. I can barely fit it next to my TV. Obligatory looks like a network router joke. The middle of the console is glossy. Can't wait for fingerprints. While you can place the PS5 horizontally with the stand, there's no way I'd want to do that. It looks so fragile, and plugging in accessories causes it to shift all around. Like all modern consoles, there's not enough storage. In fact, there's only 667 gigabytes, which, hey, that might sound like a lot, but we all know how much data just one PS5 game takes up. In order to install more storage, you have to take the shell off and unscrew this bolt to add an M.2 drive. These things alone are expensive, and it needs to have a heatsink as well. There's only 3 USB-A ports and 1 USB-C. That's not a lot. External drives can only be used for saving games and not actually playing them. Hey, hold on a second. What now? Because the PS5 is mind-blowing. I got one too. Say what you want about the design. It stands out as one of the most unique-looking consoles of all time. The DualSense controller is legendary. Even aesthetically, it looks really cool. All the buttons feel amazing to press. The button shells have a clear coat revealing the icons underneath them. It's got a very futuristic style. And the joysticks are great. There's an outer lip to help prevent your thumbs from slipping. The most impressive aspect is the adaptive triggers. For certain games, you'll feel actual resistance and tension when pushing down. It's pretty wild technology. And haptic feedback adds vibrations when running around in games, adding an extra layer of immersiveness. And if you want to play games and chat with friends, there's a microphone built right into the controller. The textures for all the PS5 accessories use the iconic PlayStation buttons, and I mean all of them. The console itself, controller, PS5 camera, Pulse 3D headset, wireless chargers, you name it. Okay, that's fine and all, but let's get into the actual games. Outside of Astra's Playroom, very few games have utilized the PS5's control features. Oh, and speaking of games, I got a question for you. Where are they? There's very few PS5 exclusives, one of them being Demon's Souls, which, okay, but that's a remake of a PS3 game. But oh yes, there's Deathloop and Death Stranding Director's Cut, but these are timed exclusives, so alright. But wait, there's also Sackboy and Horizon Forbidden West, but oh, they're on PS4. But hey, wait a second, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, that's a new one, and so is Returnal. So, summing all that up, that's really not a lot of games after, almost 2 years. And let's not forget that PlayStation is in the process of merging together PlayStation Plus and Now with this new tier system. PS Plus Essential and Extra seem fine enough, offering things like discounts, monthly downloadable games, and stuff like that. But then there's the premium option. Apparently, a catalog of 340 games from the PS1, PS2, and PSP is coming, but it's $18 a month. That is pretty steep just to play retro games that probably won't work if you download them and unsubscribe later on. Dude, you're being way too harsh. While there may not be a lot of PS5 games yet, thousands of PS4 games are backwards compatible. And you can still use the PlayStation VR with the PS5 on top of your old PS4 controller. Some PS4 games can be enhanced with Game Boost on the PS5. Blast processing is back. Games load at a blistering pace on PS5, and they look even more incredible with ray tracing, HDR, and 120 FPS for some games. The menus have been completely revamped as well. It's easier than ever to jump into a game or swap to watching a show on Netflix or YouTube.
I mean, I guess I can agree with you on some of those factors, but I haven't even brought up the accessories.
The media remote has no grips on the bottom, making it very easy to slip across the table or wobble around. Even if I had a disc PS5, there's no eject button on the remote. I like the Pulse 3D headset, but why is there a USB dongle? It should have been integrated into the PS5 itself. While this headset claims to be noise cancelling, it really only dampens outside noises. The surround sound doesn't work when it's wired up, so you can't get the full experience if you plug this into your controller. The PS5 HD camera only supports 1080p and the quality is awful. That's a little jarring when the console itself focuses so much on 4K and 8K resolutions. And honestly, it's basically only used for broadcasting gameplay, but you might as well get a nicer camera and use OBS if you're gonna bother with streaming. If you have the digital PS5 like I do, you can't use physical discs. This will go over well with preserving these games several years from now.
Oh my god, you don't know what you're talking about.
Sony's Pulse 3D headset is incredibly comfortable to wear. From the stretchable headpiece to the poofy earbuds, you can easily wear this for hours. For $100, the sound quality is pretty darn decent. Sony developed its own type of surround sound called Tempest 3D, and it captures background noises in a way that feels like reality. The media remote is completely unnecessary to own, but man does it look slick. The buttons feel great to push, and it's even got a dedicated panel for streaming apps. The PS5 HD camera is stylized to mesh perfectly with the PS5's general look. And it's extremely easy to hook up. Just plug it into the console and plop it on top of your TV to get started.
Well, some of that stuff is fine, but good luck getting a PS5. It's still nearly impossible to get one without paying a scalper's price. Finally, something we can agree on. Anyway, yeah, sorry, I'm gonna get going. I've got bigger issues to worry about. See ya.